Hello everybody, I'm Eternal Flame here, and welcome to another episode of more JJK Theories from you, yes you, and today we have a lot of theories today, because this is probably going to be by far and away the biggest episode, because I picked out a lot of theories that I think are going to be really interesting and really good. So before we get into this video, be sure to like and subscribe, like anime content like this. We have a lot more JJK content on the channel. We are going to branch into other anime content soon as well in the future, so without further ado, let's get into this. And our first theory today comes from Lightcox15, where their theory is everyone is so focused on Kenjaku having an unsatisfying death. So the other day they had thought, what if he had transferred into Tengen's body, and as a result, whenever Sukuna's at his weakness and Megami's been extracted, Kenjaku can take over, activate the merger, and he's the final boss. Now, I will admit this theory is a possible one to happen. A lot of people do want Kenjaku to come back because a lot of people view Kenjaku as a superior villain to Sukuna, which I somewhat disagree with, mainly because I think Sukuna is a better villain for Yuji, while I think Kenjaku is a better villain for the world, but I do know there are a bunch of people who do want Kenjaku to actually come back. Furthermore, we don't actually know the full-on details of how Kenjaku's brain-hopping techniques works, but we also know that Kenjaku was able to at least bring along some of the techniques with him, so if he brought along cursed spirit manipulation to still manipulate Tengen's body and activate the merger, this could potentially make sense. The reason why we know he's able to transfer over techniques is because of his ability to still have anti-gravity, which came from Kaori Itadori, so he should still be able to transfer cursed spirit manipulation with him. However, my perspective on this theory is a little bit weird, and I think this theory is actually kind of unlikely to happen, purely because of the established rule that Kenjaku had placed into the Culling Games, that Sukuna would be the one to activate the merger in case he died, or that the burden of activating the merger was placed onto Megami Fushiguro. But at the same time, this could also be Kenjaku setting up to potentially awaken the merger the second he sees Sukuna in a weakened spot. So this could either be a classic Gege fake out where Kenjaku reveals himself to be the final villain once again in the shadows and kill-steals Yuji, which I don't think is going to happen, or Kenjaku is actually dead and this theory doesn't happen. However, I do think this is a good theory that has a good amount of possibility to happening, as well as Kenjaku being a life-self villain that I can see Gege pulling something like this off. It also ends up solving the main issue that I and a lot of people have with the merger as a final antagonist, because if the merger is the final antagonist, it's just a giant monster of cursed energy. Like, that's all it would be. It doesn't have any personality, it doesn't have any relation to the cast. It would just be like fighting a giant kaiju, which is why a lot of people don't really want the merger to actually be the final boss. Though I have seen people who do want the merger to be the final boss as well. Now, our next theory comes from Morgan's brother, and which is in relation to Yuji and the potential of Yuji not having just 2 curse techniques, but 4 curse techniques. With the 4 curse techniques that they think Yuji is going to end up having is blood manipulation that comes from his brothers, anti-gravity which comes from his mom, Sukuna's curse technique which is going to come from, well, being Sukuna's vessel and still being soaked in Sukuna's curse energy, and finally his own unique type of curse technique. Now, this theory is really hard to say whether this ends up coming to fruition or not. There is some build-up to Yuji getting Sukuna's curse technique, mainly because of Gojo's own statement. There's also the possibility that Yuji's going to get Kaori Itadori's technique, mainly because of the fact that Gege specifically made the anti-gravity belong to Kaori Itadori, so there is the potential of him getting both of those curse techniques, as well as him having his own original curse technique. Now, if he did have them, he would have had to awaken them over the 1-month time skip, mainly because we know for a fact Yuji didn't have a curse technique beforehand, because of the fact that if he did have a curse technique, that curse technique would have been taken away from Higuruma in their domain battle. However, there is some more build up to the possibility of Yuji having 4 curse techniques, mainly because of one of Yuki's statements when she was battling against Kenjaku about the possibility of Kenjaku having 3 to 4 curse techniques, and that was what the normal person's human brain could handle before they get over-fried, and that's why Yurakoto having Rika or Moto was so important, because of the fact that Rika was able to store several curse techniques, even more than a normal human brain could take. So this theory is certainly possible to happen, I will say that. Now, our next theory comes from Alexis Thompson, where their theory is about the possibility of Yuji accidentally doing a positive curse energy fueled version of a Black Flash. This is now possible because of the fact that it has recently been revealed that Yuji does have access to RCT, and not just that, a very, very strong version of RCT, mainly because of the fact that he's able to heal off not 1, not 2, not 3, but 6 lethal blows to his own body, which is absolutely insane, considering the amount of curse energy that healing lethal blows to one's own body usually takes a person. The reason they believe that this is possible is because it would give Yuji a completely different understanding of curse energy and the concept that is curse energy that even Gojo and Sukuna have never experienced. Since everyone in the universe other than Maki and Toji fights using negative emotions, fights using curse energy, while Maki and Toji use physical strength, but that's not important. So what if Yuji is the one who uses positive emotions to fight instead of using negative emotions to fight? Which would allow him to embody positive emotions, which Sukuna has become sort of the embodiment of negative emotions and anything to gain from negative emotions. Yuji would end up becoming the embodiment of everything to gain through positive emotions. It would also be something that massively breaks Sorcerer Society, because Sorcerer Society is completely based around curse curse energy, which curse energy in itself is extremely negative energy based. So if something was able to become positive based, if they could find a positive based emotion curse energy type of fuel source, it would completely change society for a better type of society. And more importantly, it would allow Yuji to actually fight as who he was meant to be, as the protector that Yuji had always wanted to be, and the protector that Yuji had set up his life to be. After all, since the beginning, Yuji had always set up his life to be able to give people proper deaths, and while he's never been able to succeed at it, he has been able to protect several people throughout his lifetime. Even though there were some people who ended up dying for him, he'd still be able to truly fight as himself and not have to fight in accordance to any system. Now, I will say, I do like the idea of this as a theory. A positive energy fueled Black Flash should be entirely possible, since it's just applying curse energy at 0.00001, okay, a millionth of a second. So if he were to apply positive curse energy instead of negative curse energy during that speed, it could end up making a positive curse energy fueled Black Flash, but at the same time, we don't really know if this is possible or not. However, if this ends up being possible and it has this meta-narrative type element that I actually really like, that the comment had emphasized on and focused on, then I think it would really work well if Yuji ends up using a positive curse energy Black Flash, and then other characters start to use it as well, using Yuji as the example, and Yuji being the one who paves the way for a new sorcerer type of generation, breaking away from the old one that Gojo had tried so hard to break away from. Now, our next theory comes from Divin Marks, where it's a very interesting theory about the importance of the left eye in Jujutsu Kaisen. For example, when Gojo lifts up his blindfold in his battle against Miguel, he shows off his left eye and not the other eye immediately, where he goes immediately to his left eye in order to show off the 6 eyes. Or when Kenjaku absorbs Mahito, his left eye is the one that's glowing while the right eye went black. And finally, Nobara dying because it was their left side of their face that ended up getting hit, not their right side of their face that ended up getting hit. So overall, I think this is more just coincidences than actual theories. However, I think it's very interesting that JJK continues to repeatedly put so much focus on the left side of someone's body and not the right side, but I don't think this is actually going to lead into anything in the plot. However, it's still an interesting observation, so congratulations for finding that observation, or whoever did find that observation. Now, our next theory comes from STH. I don't know how to say your full name because your full name is weird. So anyways, we're going to get into the actual theory, which is about Sukuna's shrine, where they say in their theory that they think that shrine is a technique for storing other techniques. So basically, Sukuna has to eat people through his domain or some other method, since we know Urame is his chef. Once he's gained a technique, it is stored in the black box of his brain, locked away until further notice. Reason being, sorcerers can only handle up to 2 to 3 techniques at once, as stated by Yuki. So Cleave and Dismantle are his default stored techniques, and to use his other techniques he has to chant Box Open. They also think that the symbols on his bodies are stored techniques that are engraved onto his soul. Now, I do think it is extremely likely that Sukuna does have the ability to copy techniques or consume techniques through eating another person. It would also be in line with what we find out about Yuta Okoto, that for Yuta Okoto to copy a technique, he actually needs to eat a part of the person. But for Sukuna to have full access to the technique, he likely does need to eat a full person through whatever the specific method is. After all, we do know Urame knows several rituals as well, which actually might end up making it so more likely that Sukuna does actually need to eat people in order to use their techniques. It should be noted though that Yuki does say the maximum amount of techniques that person can have is 3 to 4, not 2 to 3, because that's something that's very important. There's also the potential that Cleave and Dismantle are just the same techniques, but at the same time they could also be different techniques. I do think it's very likely that Sukuna does actually need to eat people in order to copy techniques, if he does have a very similar copy technique to Yuta Okoto. The tattoos also being something that Sukuna has access to as their own curse techniques is something I've heard in the community for a while, and it's something I see as being extremely likely, since JJK usually doesn't do things unintentionally, so those all being curse things that Sukuna is able to store and utilize does make a lot of sense. So overall, I do see this theory being extremely likely. I do think it's also going to lead into the potential of Sukuna eating somebody in the future, though I'm not entirely sure who they're going to eat, especially at this point. However, we all know that JJK did said a while back that Sukuna was going to eat somebody, but at the same time, that person they could eat could actually be Tengen. However, we aren't done with this person yet, because they actually had 2 theories that they had commented down in this same comment. As you guys can tell, I only read out the first half of this comment, where they basically say they have a little bit of a crackpot theory, where to summarize the theory, they basically think that it could be possible that Sukuna was able to use Cleave and Dismantle through blood manipulation, and that blood manipulation is Sukuna's original technique. And that was the method of how Yuji had gained access to blood manipulation, thanks to what Gojo had said a while back of Yuji eventually gaining access to Sukuna's curse technique. So if Yuji had gained blood manipulation through that, rather than actually gaining it through his brothers like I and a lot of people have thought, then that could have been the method of how Yuji was able to gain access to blood manipulation, manipulation, and that cleave and dismantle is just an application of blood manipulation. Where Sukuna, through a mix of extraction techniques, binding vows, as well as his massive amount of curse energy and reverse curse energy, was able to basically use blood manipulation up to its pinnacle. And they actually even have an explanation for how cleave and dismantle could be blood manipulation, where they say to explain cleave and dismantle, he could turn his blood into some kind of invisible water vapor like blood gas and sharpen it to produce his slashing abilities. The binding vows would drastically increase their imperceptibility and cutting ability. The fire arrow could also either be straight up blood or the aforementioned blood gas that was superheated to become fire. When Megumi fought the finger bearer, he said something like exchange your interpretation when he expanded his domain. This sort of proves that techniques are all interpretation, and a technique is only limited to how far the sorcerer can expand it. Given how intelligent Sukuna is, he probably could have made enough technique expansions to make all those symbols on his body. Now, this is something, while I'm not as sure about that it's possible that Sukuna does have access to blood manipulation, this is something that I can see being entirely possible. A huge message that Gojo had to Megumi is how much interpretation actually matters to your curse technique. If you have the right interpretation, you are able to change the form of your curse technique to become more and more useful. For example, that was how Megumi was able to access his shadows and basically use his shadows as another dimension that he could store people in or store things in, as well as use them to camouflage himself just by changing the interpretation of what his technique was capable of. Mahito is also an excellent example of this, who Mahito is someone who drastically changes his interpretation of his curse technique all the time through experimentation and movements on the fly. Through doing this and changing his interpretation repeatedly, he was able to become as strong as he was. After all, most of Mahito's power-ups are just him finding out new interpretations and new ways for him to use this technique, as well as manipulate the souls. Several abilities in Jujutsu Kaisen are just revolved around interpretation, and if one can make the right interpretation, they are able to completely change themselves and make themselves into a different animal. So someone like Sukuna, someone who is known to be the peak of sorcery and the peak of jujitsu, should be able to do this same thing, because we've even seen him do something like that before with the spatial dismantle after seeing Mahoraga do it. So it could be very possible that he have figured out all this through blood manipulation and changed his blood manipulation to be as versatile as it is today. However, while I do believe it's possible, I don't see it being likely that Sukuna does have access to blood manipulation at this point. I just don't see it being likely, but it is still something that is very possible and very, very interesting to think about, so good theory. Now, our next theory is about the possibility of Yuji absorbing the merger into his very body and using that to control the merger, basically giving Yuji his final endgame type of power-up. Now, I do think Yuji absorbing and controlling the merger in the end is something very, very possible. After all, we still don't know up to this point the reason why Kenjaku even created Yuji, nor why Kenjaku has so much faith or hope in Yuji Itadori, or expectations in Yuji. We just know that Kenjaku does have several expectations in Yuji Itadori, so this could be the reason, but we don't fully know if this is the reason or not. So this is a very plausible theory in my opinion. Now, our next theory comes from Joseph Livingston, where their theory is about the potential of Yuji becoming a curse in the future and dying to Sukuna. Where in this theory, they say that Yuji will end up dying at Sukuna's hands, but they'll be surrounded by allies just as Yuji had won so long ago. However, due to Yuji's unbreakable spirit, as well as maybe a desire that he still had because he didn't succeed in saving Megumi, he will end up becoming a curse, and become not just any curse, but the new humanity curse, completing the story arc between himself and Mahito. This would allow him to gain access to likely a new soul-type curse technique, as well as gain access to the abilities of his friends, or at least that's what they believe in this theory. It would also allow him to modify his own soul as well as modify other people's souls, which could be the method of how he ends up freeing Megumi from Sukuna. Now, the biggest support for this theory is the fact that Yuji acknowledges himself and Mahito to be the same, to be the one and the same thing. So if Yuji ends up becoming fully Mahito, but just the opposite of Mahito, where he is the curse of humanity, but in a good way rather than how Mahito was the curse and distrust of humanity, Yuji could be the curse and belief in humanity and the fear that could spawn from that, then Yuji ends up becoming massively more powerful, and this could be of its potential way in order to beat Sukuna. Now, while I do think this theory is possible, I don't see this theory being likely to happen at all, mainly because of one very, very important thing. In order for one to become a vengeful spirit after they die, they need to be killed by something that doesn't have curse energy imbued into it. So if Sukuna is the one who kills Yuji, he's not going to become a cursed spirit. If he does end up coming back and becomes the representation of humanity, that could, in a different way, that could be interesting, but it couldn't be through becoming a curse. However, there's also the chance that Yuji is not the standard, and that Yuji might not function in the same way that most normal people do function, so that's also a possibility. Now, Now up next we have a total of 3 theories from Cosmic Swine, where their first theory is that Sukuna accidentally broke his binding vow with Yuji by killing Gojo, and the consequence is that he can't kill anyone close to Yuji. My reasoning is that it seems for a binding vow a little too convenient that it breaks if Sukuna just leaves his body, and also the stipulation was that he gets to take over Yuji's body for 1 minute after staying in chain, and then Yuji gets control again, but Sukuna never went back to Yuji, therefore not ending the vow by going back to Yuji. And because Sukuna killed Gojo, someone close to Yuji, he broke the binding vow, or he broke the vow by not going back into Yuji. Now this theory is a little bit 50-50 for me in my opinion. I don't think Sukuna actually hurting or killing Gojo ends up crossing the theory in my opinion, mainly because I do think the minute-long timer has actually passed, so I don't think that the binding vow is no longer in place because of that specific thing, so I do think Sukuna can't kill other people outside of what he did in Yuji Kuna's body. However, what might be possible is he did actually end up crossing the binding vow when he took the gamble by ripping off his finger or putting it into Megumi. The reason why is because the way that Sukuna put his finger into Megumi might be a little bit more forceful, so it might actually count as hurting Megumi, which was what went against the binding vow because Sukuna was not allowed to hurt anybody. Pause. But what actually might end up breaking the binding vow was the fact that Sukuna broke off a part of Yuji's finger. Now Sukuna himself believes that there wasn't any immediate consequences because Yuji didn't consider himself a person. However, it could be potentially true that he was completely wrong and just the binding vow consequences are going to happen much later. After all, the consequences of breaking a binding vow is completely unpredictable as stated by Kenjaku and can happen at any point. It is not immediate, so that actually might be where Sukuna had gone completely wrong and had ended up breaking the binding vow. I do think it could be possible that Sukuna did double cross the binding vow, but I don't think it was for killing Gojo. I do think it was for something else, and that Sukuna might actually be a little bit wrong about his understanding of the binding vow. Now the second theory is actually in relation to Nobara, where it could be potentially possible that Nobara's death had been confirmed off-screen to Yuji so that Sukuna forgets about her completely so that she can be brought back in to fight against Sukuna. This is mainly so Sukuna ends up forgetting about Nobara as another factor, just so they could keep it as secret from them, but this also ends up resulting in Nobara still being able to be useful in the final battle, as well as catching Sukuna completely off guard, so he's normally not suspecting Nobara to potentially come in, being one of the only people who is actually able to affect his soul. Now, I don't see this one being anywhere near as likely, mainly because of the fact that no one, and I mean no one, knew it would be possible for Sukuna to take over Yuji's body at any point, so I don't see this confirmation of an off-screen confirmation being what likely happened. Everyone, I think, just had faith that Yuji would be able to keep Sukuna in control, so unless Nobara just was suddenly able to be healed after Sukuna had left his body, and they were confirmed to just be kept on life support and barely be alive until someone like Yuji, for example, could heal her soul in order to reform it so Nobara could still be alive again, I don't see this theory being likely at all, but it is possible that it could happen. Now, the final theory is the possibility of Yuji consuming the merger in order to gain enough power to defeat Sukuna, and that it's going to end up being Megumi who will have to save him instead of Yuji being the one to save him. Now, this mainly comes from a narrative perspective of them thinking it being a very interesting narrative that it actually has to end up with Megumi saving Yuji instead of Yuji saving Megumi, because Yuji ended up pushing himself this far in order to actually save Megumi, so now it's Megumi's turn to save Yuji from the monster he ended up becoming in order to take down Sukuna once and for all. I do see this theory being by far and away the most likely, because even if Yuji were to absorb the merger, they would end up likely becoming a monster of destruction eventually, because I don't see him being able to hold off on all of those minds at once forever. I do think he would be able to hold on for a little bit and hold on to who he was for a little bit, but I don't think it would be forever, but who really knows up to this point. However, this would be really interesting to see and a really cool narrative to see, and a really cool way to make Yuji basically the final antagonist until Megumi has to save him, basically being a cool reflection of what happened in the beginning of the series where Megumi had to save Yuji once again. So our next theory is from Sabi, and it's about the potential of Yuji being Sukuna's reincarnated twin, where they say in the theory that it could be possible that Sukuna doesn't actually have a cursed technique, however he has a cursed trait, which is cursed consumption, which is what allows him to get other cursed techniques, similar to how the Six Eyes itself isn't actually a cursed technique, but rather a cursed trait or a body trait. That's why it's connected to Gojo, where even if Gojo runs out of cursed energy, he is still able to use the Six Eyes, where they believe that it could be possible that Yuji originally did have an extremely strong cursed technique, however Kenjaku had sacrificed it in order to put Yuji as the middle ground between heavenly restriction and sorcery, like Sukuna has called out, and the comparisons between Yuji and Maki continue to exist, about Yuji being kind of like a heavenly restriction, but not really being like a heavenly restriction like Maki and Toji's. However, this would end up making Yuji the perfect balance, allowing him to have great access to his soul abilities, to his physical strength, as well as great abilities with curse energy, making him basically the perfect type of creature that Kenjaku ended up creating. Also, they do believe that it could be possible that Yuji is going to end up being the last person standing in all of this battle, which is something I see being extremely likely, and that's when it's going to be likely that Yuji is going to end up getting the backstory reveal that we've been waiting for so long, and why Kenjaku had done so much in order to specifically create Yuji Itadori. Now, as you guys can see, there was a lot more to this theory, so if you want to pause and take the time to read it, it is really good, because this is just basically the theory being summarized, but I do think this is a really good theory. It could be very potentially possible that Sukuna does have a curse consumption like trait, and we just do not know it yet, because we don't know enough about how Sukuna even functions. But I do see this theory being very, very possible, and I really like it a lot. So yeah, that's about all the theories we have for this episode. Do you like any of them in particular? Do you dislike any of them? I want to hear what you guys think in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and comment down your own theories, because it might be down in the next episode. Anyways, I'm gonna see you all later. Peace out. Have a good day.